Our praises arise. Jesus is near, your glory is here. The oceans and hills, skies, hidden in faces and pain and delight. Your glory is here, and I get a glimpse of you. Silence and prayer, in bread and wine. Somehow the common becomes the divine. You're making me new. I'm starting to see you. Our praises arise as we come to recognize Jesus is near, your glory is here. Our praises arise as we come to recognize Jesus is near, your glory is here.
When I get to the end and it's just the start, hold it all together, pull it all apart. Nothing to fix without a broken heart. Well, I am the driftwood and you're the tide. The sun on the surface, the glare in my eyes. Once I could see, but now I am blind. Be the voice that shakes me up. Be the words when I don't know much. Give myself to be by your side. I would lose my life for the love I find. Well, you came and moved me to the core. Yeah, you broke me in pieces, but I just want more. And now I laugh at the person that I was before. Funny how you were so hard to find. Then I could see, but now I am blind. Be the voice that shakes me up. Be the words when I don't know much. I give myself to be by your side. I would lose my life for the love I find. Be the voice that shakes me up. Be the words when I don't know much. I give myself to be by your side. I would lose my life for the love I find. I would lose my life for the love I find. called poor among the people of the Lord. Let all the hungry eat, and every stranger have a seat. Justice roll like a mighty river, crashing with the sound of waves. The mercy fall like springtime showers, blowing in on the winds of grace. No one be oppressed among the people of the Lord. Every hurt be healed, and every voice be heard. The justice roll like a mighty river, crashing with the sound of waves. Let mercy fall like springtime showers, blowing in on the winds of grace. In this kingdom, the mourners laugh, the slave is free, the battered whole and love. In this kingdom, love will win, and peace descend like a dove. In this kingdom, the mourners laugh, the slave is free, the battered whole and love. In this kingdom, love will win, and peace descend like a dove. Let justice roll like a mighty river, crashing with the sound of waves. Let mercy fall like springtime showers, blowing in on the winds of grace. Let justice roll like a mighty river, crashing with the sound of waves. Let mercy fall like springtime showers, blowing in on the winds of grace.
Reading from Mark 11, beginning at verse 1. When they were approaching Jerusalem, at Bethpage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it back here immediately.'" They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. As they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing, untying the colt?" They told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. And then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12.
Good morning. We'll go ahead and dismiss the children's all of them. And there's 75% of the attendance gone, just like that. I'm still here. Quick announcement. April 16th, of course, is the Nehemiah Action. And if you notice in your bulletin, I've printed off a half-sheet flyer. The purpose of that is twofold. One, so that you know these flyers exist. And if you want some of them, a stack of them, whatever, I can print some off, give them to you, pass them out to friends, family members, relatives, etc. There's also a QR code on that. So you can go ahead and just register. Make sure it's in your calendar, right? And you'll get that reminder email and all of that. And then it helps us to know how many people are going to be attending, right, as those registrations start to roll in. I hope you've been inviting people. Don't let it slip away, right? People need touches. People need to be followed up on, and we're getting closer and closer each week. I had a really great chance to talk to somebody yesterday who could be a really nice contact to a larger group. And so if you know anybody like that, someone who leads or helps facilitate a group that would be interested in participating in the Nehemiah Action, reach out to those kinds of people as well. If you're from out of town, but you visit from time to time, and you're visiting family today, I mean, it'd be the perfect opportunity to come back and visit them again and go to the Nehemiah Action with them, if there's anyone in here like that today. So we really want to get people out for this and have it be a powerful action. Today's story displays for us a powerful action. An action that Jesus took, a display, a kind of performative action that mobilized a lot of people. And we're going to explore that, and today's going to be kind of a more reflective time as we just kind of sit with this story and hopefully let it speak to us in a fresh way, see what it can mean for us. Do maybe what Catherine Keller, theologian, would say, a dream reading. I want you to be left with some questions and want you to be left with some wondering and the ability to be a bit introspective on a story that has a lot going on. I want to start with the end. I think that when we look at this last little part of the text today, we can see the emotional place that Jesus was in. It helps to clarify for us what's going on in this last week of Jesus' life. And it helps us to place our own Lenten journey in a frame, giving it some meaning for us. This is the last week of Lent. It's a kind of transitional week, right? Because next week, of course, is the finality to this season, the big celebratory day. And today hints at that, of course, with the celebrations occurring around Jesus. But there's also a dark hint to the story as well. I love the way that Mark writes his gospel, his proclamation of the good news. It's terse. It moves quickly. It's dense. So we get some really lovely sentences from Mark's gospel. Gratitude to those in the world who have worked so hard on translation. The NRSV says, when he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, it was already late, and he went out to Bethany with the 12. What a wonderfully simple, anticlimactic kind of posture in which we see Jesus here. Looking at the temple, just looking around, seeing what's going on, realizing it's late. What a detail. What, was he getting hungry, maybe? Getting tired? The sun's about to set, doesn't want to go outside the city at dark, something like that. Whatever it is, he realizes it's late and just goes back to where he's staying with the disciples. Of course, we all know the story of Palm Sunday. But if we had just started with that verse and had never heard or read the story before, we might be surprised at what came before it. What a dramatic scene to have occurred before such a simple return home. or return to the home of his friends, which, as Jesus made clear throughout his life, were his homes. He rides in on a donkey with a huge crowd of people singing a song of deliverance. Save us, save us, save us, is what the word Hosanna means. It might be hard for us to hear this story in a dramatic fashion. It might be hard for us to hear it in as dramatic a fashion as it would have occurred had we been able to see something like it. I don't know if you have this experience. I do. We talked about it a little bit in the 10 o'clock hour. For many of you, you may read a book, and it's like watching a movie. Books are cheaper movies for you. I don't have that experience. I love reading books. And I love how they can be moving and enrapturing and compelling, right? But there is something still different to me about seeing it visually. I've read 2 times through the science fiction trilogy, The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. That's how they say it at the end of the Audible version, so I know that's how you say it. And I loved it, and it was formative and impactful and compelling, and I think about it all the time, and I talk about it, right? But a Netflix series just came out based on the books, and Britt and I have watched the first 2 episodes, and it's a lot more intense to see things displayed visually. I'm thinking of a crowd of people surrounding Jesus, throwing their clothes on the ground, throwing their garments in the road, waving palm branches, throwing those on the ground as well, and chanting. A group of people chanting is a big deal, isn't it? It's not something we see a lot, especially around a particular figure or a person. Right? If we're being honest, if we can imagine that scene, it might be a little bit disconcerting. Speaking of movies that have come out about books, there's a new iteration, of course, of the Dune saga. And in the newest movie, Part 2, there's this scene where a large group of people is embracing one of the characters as a Messiah figure. And they become swept up in this kind of frenzy. And the tone there is portrayed more negatively. Because we know how those things can go sometimes, right? But it's powerful to see. It's moving. It moves us in a certain way. Whether that is something we like or something we don't like, something we agree with or something we don't agree with, there's no denying that a crowd of people chanting is a powerful thing. Last week I mentioned that Britt and I had watched, and now we have finished the documentary series on Netflix, Turning Point, about the Cold War. And in that documentary series, with a total of 11 hours, there's a lot of footage of groups gathering and chanting, right? In the history of the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, there's lots of people-led movements, right? In the whole history. Early on, of course, you've got movements to embrace socialistic or communistic forms of government. And then in the 90s, you've got all the regions around Russia who have these popular movements to withdraw from the Soviet Union. And so you have all these scenes of thousands of people in the street, and they're all chanting the same thing, right? A free Estonia, a free Lithuania. Or maybe they're chanting someone's name, Gorbachev, Gorbachev. And no matter what the reason for these events are, where people gather and chant, something always happens, regardless of ideological aims. Something always happens. What is it? What do you think always happens when there's a big group of people? Who gets called out? Law enforcement. They're always there. In all these scenes, right, you have the military has to show up. Why? Because it could turn really bad. It could get really chaotic or violent or something, right? And it's not just that. There's always the threat of change. And powerful people in place don't want that, right? Like we have the image, of course, of Tiananmen Square where the Chinese government just rolled over its people with tanks. We have the scenes in Ukraine. 4 different times in the history of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had a popular movement. And those things are never a good sign for people in power. There's always tension. Even when things don't turn violent, there's always tension, right? You've got the big line of the anti-riot people, and then you've got the tens of thousands of people facing them. Why does that happen? Why is there tension? Well, what does it display for a crowd of people to gather together? It displays that there's something amiss. It displays there's something broken. Something is off. If this many people are disenchanted or feel that they've been disenfranchised, then there's something wrong. There's something wrong in the system, right? Inherently, then, the gathering of people is a threat to those who hold current power, regardless of ideological standing. Large gatherings of people is threatening. It feels threatening, and it is inherently filled with tension. We hear the story of Palm Sunday, a story that churches around the world today will celebrate. Some will even reenact. A story that I don't know about you, but I heard all the time, right? In Sunday school, I can picture it. I can picture nice Jesus sitting on the donkey, coming into town. We've become so familiar with it that we lose out on the power of what is occurring here. We lose out on the inherent tension that is building. We lose out on that feeling of threat and fear of those in power. We lose out on the effort put out by the disciples, by Jesus, the planning, the intention, the tactical choices. We lose out on the fact that the watchful eye of those who fear this tension is closely following this procession. Save us, save us, save us, comes the chant of the crowd to this one man. Rulers don't like talk of salvation. Rulers don't like talk of deliverance. It implies, and it's not really even implicit, it's explicit, right? It says that they have failed to deliver on the promises to the people, or that they have failed to provide for the people a life worth living. The problem is that we have forgotten so much of this text because these words have become so lost as they have taken on a pious remembrance of the event. Hosanna is a word that you will hear in worship songs, whose intent is not to cry out about the oppression experienced by the masses, but is a word used to cry out a kind of praise of an individual to an idea of some kind, perhaps. The words save and salvation have come to imply simply an escape from this life and a deliverance into a more blissful afterlife. And while we can clearly see, and I admit that the stakes feel very high as we think through what comes after this life, it is interesting to note that you have never seen a group of people gather in the streets crying out in mass to be sent to a better place when they die. Have you ever noticed that? That's not what galvanizes people or brings them together. That idea has never evoked power. It never really creates with any sort of tension or unease or distrust or fear from those who hold power. In fact, that idea is fine. It's not a threat. And so we spend a moment to reflect on this text. And may we truly reflect on it. May we not relegate it to some safer or more sanitized version of what Mark wants to put before us. We must hear the words and hold their images. The people want a king. The people wanted a leader who would lead them to justice and equity, who would care for them as people. They wanted to be delivered from those who led them currently, and they chanted. And they enacted. They put down their clothing down on the ground. Imagine that scene. Imagine it. Right? Think about it in a culture where everyone had some kind of like undergarment, like a tunic, and then an outer garment, like a robe. you've got a big group of people who are just standing in that undergarment. And all of those robes, thousands? Even if it's just hundreds and hundreds, but probably thousands, as this was a time of festival in the city. And Mark says, as those who went to the festival heard Jesus was coming. Thousands of robes laid on the ground, paving the way for the king to ride into the city to take his throne. That's a powerful image. And it is one that was recognized as such by the leaders. Mark doesn't mention it in this paragraph, but the alternate text today in the lectionary is from the book of John. And in John's account of this same scene, we see at the end that the Pharisees say to each other, "There's nothing we can do. The world has gone after him." Right? We can't stop this movement. There are too many people. John uses the word world. Everyone has followed after this guy. Whatever efforts we had to try to slow this down have failed. You kind of feel for the Pharisees in that moment. Right? Let's sit with the tension here and not make this like a us versus them thing. There's probably a lot of people who weren't following Jesus who thought they were doing the right thing, that wanted to help, that didn't like the systems and structures around them either, but did their best to try to help people, to try to make things a little bit more just. But as we see Jesus riding on a donkey, not a war horse, it makes us wonder if you can only play by certain rules for so long before you have to start asking whether the game is rigged or whether we're just playing the wrong game. How can you know when that's the case? When you see massive discontent. When you hear the voices of many, many crying out, "Save us." When you look around and you see struggle and turmoil and pain and repeated failures. But we insulate ourselves. You know, the Roman legions stationed here insulate themselves physically from the people, of course. Pilate lives in a palace, a fortress. Soldiers, though not an easy life, definitely did not have to farm or live a subsistence level like the peasants around them. The temple leadership living in the city isolated and protected themselves from the pain and struggle of the people around them through their particular place of authority. The Pharisees shielded themselves from this pain through their religious commitments. Which of these categories, or perhaps a blend, shield us? Would we be out with the crowd around Jesus today? Would we feel like we might lose our respectability or our credibility if we joined the song of those who sang for deliverance? Would we not join because we are too benefited, much like the temple leadership or the Romans? Would we not join because we are perhaps the occupying class of those who suffer? Perhaps this would keep us from joining in the song of the cry for deliverance. Perhaps we've just not developed the interior strength required to stand with Jesus. He warned us, it's hard to follow me. It's hard. You know, as you go through the rest of the week, Holy Week, Jesus finds himself in situation after situation of tension the whole time. He's in the temple proclaiming this and that thing that nobody's liking. Well, the people love it, but none of the leadership are liking, right? He's implying that Roman collusion has hurt the people. He's saying the temple system is broken. He's calling to account those who have left the path, as we talked about the last few weeks. Have you ever really thought about these times? Thought about what it must have taken for Jesus to day after day speak in this way to those he knew disagreed with him? Do you know, have you had those moments where you know that it's tough to speak directly to somebody you know will not agree with you and who holds more power than you do? It's very easy. It's very tempting to want to placate the people we speak to, right? That might just come from our ideas of politeness. We don't want to walk around always being offensive to people. We want people to like us. That's natural. But Jesus was offensive the whole rest of the week of his life. Of course, the next day after he goes back to Jerusalem from spending that first night in Bethany, he does this demonstration where he overturns the tables and blocks off the entrance to the temple and says, this place has become a place that harbors thieves. That takes a baseline of courage, right? It takes at least the bottom line of saying, I'm okay with being arrested, right? He wasn't arrested, but the gospel writers point out the reason is, and it's said explicitly, there were too many people on board. And the people in power didn't want to arrest Jesus in front of everybody. So the possibility was certainly there. That takes courage. And then following those days, we see him in direct confrontations and interactions with the temple leadership, who are all theologically trained, and he's debating them, and he's picking apart their theology in order to demonstrate to them that you are no longer serving the people, and you have built these things for yourself to shield yourself from that responsibility. That's a difficult place to be. It really is a difficult place to be. We have to take that seriously. I found myself in a similar situation this week. I had a conversation with a local stakeholder, and as I went back through that conversation, I realized there were a lot of times where that tension had become hard to carry. It's easy to slip into the idea of like negotiation, right? We're all used to negotiation because we all have at one time or another been in some business setting of some kind where we had to negotiate. There's a give and a take. That's how conversations work, right? But how much of our work for justice in the world, how much of what we work to do as we hear the cries of people around us should be done less in a negotiating way and more in the Jesus Holy Week kind of way? I don't have a strong answer for that question. I don't know if there is one. But I do know that the power of the Spirit seen in Jesus on Palm Sunday is a power that moves humanity. It is a power that can save. It is a path that can lead to deliverance, and we have seen it throughout the last 2,000 years. On the flip side, there is a warning for us in Holy Week. If you were to read the biblical text, it's only a few pages, a couple pages of the Bible, right? Where we see the crowd again, this time not crying out, save us, but crying out, crucify him. How could that have occurred so quickly? The history of those in power hasn't changed much. If you look at world events, right, there have always been massive campaigns where people who have money and resources and planted individuals get the ball rolling to plant disinformation, to turn the will of the people from where they once were to the exact opposite goals. And here we see it again in Jesus. As they're in the temple, the people, the leaders, are worried about what people are going to think if they just move on Jesus right away. He's a prophet, they say. The people think he's a prophet. We'll be in big trouble if we touch him. So what do? They come up with all these plans. Let's turn the people closest to him. If we can get one insider to betray him. Let's set up a false trial where people just lie. People just give disinformation. Let's bribe one of his followers. Hey, let's be secretive and underhanded and arrest him at night so he's not with the crowd. All of these things together, they just sound so familiar to us. Don't they? Bribery, corruption, secrecy. That's how the world's power operates. That's what Jesus was talking about the whole time. Those who love darkness want to stay in darkness because it covers up their evil deeds. And it worked. It worked. They crucified, as Peter will go on to say at the day of Pentecost, the Lord of glory. I think if there's someone you want to listen to, it would have been Jesus, right? But there was another story that was being told. Jesus tells a story of abundance, of generosity, of laying down our lives for each other, of a beloved community that he calls the kingdom of God, the activity, the rule, reign, agency of God in the world. Jesus tells the great story of the prophets, of Moses, stories of deliverance. Jesus tells stories of healing, a release for those who are captive through the burdensome structures of debt. Jesus calls for jubilee. Jesus tells stories that made us all feel alive. Jesus tells story after story after story with his parables of what it means to live in a world where everything is so out of our own control we feel powerless. And then he calls time and time again to unite together, to build a community in the face of that, to play by different rules. Ultimately, the story of hope that things can be made right. And we can internalize those stories, and we can have life. The competing narrative that keeps speaking into people's hearts, it keeps speaking into our lives, the story of scarcity, that there's only so much to go around. And so we have to fight and claw to get it. Or we have to be quiet and not do anything to hold on to the little that we do have. The story of fear. If those who are in power aren't in power anymore, there will be chaos. The story of despair, that we cannot move forward, that there's just too much that is too big, that is crushing it around us. We can internalize those stories, and they destroy us. I spoke with someone this past week who's been struggling immensely, who's living on the streets out of a car that is not running. And as she shared a lot of her story, it was a long conversation, some things just popped up for me. And I've been in enough of these kinds of conversations to know that probably nothing I say is going to land. It's not going to fix anything. It's not going to change anything, right? That's not how humans work in general, but certainly not when we reach certain points in our internal lives. But some things popped up to me that I just thought, well, hey, I'm going to offer them up. And I offered her a few different gifts. One, believe it or not, was that she doesn't matter to the power structures that are pursuing her, right? There was paranoia. There was fear. There was always looking over the shoulder. And I said, they don't care about you, and that's freeing. Trust me, you can get your car fixed, and no one's going to sabotage it. But no matter what I said, the response was, that can't work because of this. That would just be pointless because of this. What was so striking and saddening was the resignation that had become so deep that it had become ontological. Right? The very structure of her world itself was one that worked against her as an individual. In her mind, the very nature of the world is one that works against her. And there's not really anything I can do or say to speak to that, because ultimately that is her experience. And how many countless other people have found themselves in that place? And while we may not be there personally right now this morning, we're probably not too far off if we really are honest about the way we approach our world. And so in this final week of Lent, we face a powerful story of Jesus, and we have to stand before it honestly and let it mirror to us who it is that we are being. Jesus, as I mentioned, brings all of this faith and hope that is so clearly manifested in these courageous kinds of self-possessed actions. It's this beautiful display of a deep faith that we see in Jesus during Holy Week. And then, as I mentioned, there's this utter failure at the end of the week. The failure that we will celebrate and reenact together on Good Friday at 6:30 p.m. The time where we will reflect on those moments of Jesus' life, those final moments where despair does overcome him and crush down around him, where the situation of defeat undoes him. But in the movement of faith, the faith that we have seen over the last couple of weeks, the faith that leads Jesus to a place where he knows he will face those moments at the end. He knows he will face them because he knows what leads to those moments are times like Sunday and Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. He knows the actions he's going to take in the temple will lead him to Friday. And all of that faith and hope that we see leads to something very magical that will occur next Sunday, something wondrous and surprising. But we will never have that movement. That will never be our story. We will never go through that same journey of Jesus. We will never relive that arduous path to glory if we can't even get to Palm Sunday. If we're not able to embrace following Jesus even at the very beginning. So reflect with me on this story. What is it that was shown to you? Would you be in the crowd? Would you stand with the people as they are crying out? Hey, if there's a huge gathering of people crying out for deliverance, I don't think you have to determine whether or not you agree. Just show up. I don't know when that will happen next. Probably not for some time. There's not really any massive demonstrations on the calendar, right? Those things tend to emerge organically. We do have a gathering, of course, on April 16th, the Nehemiah Action, but that's more like the temple Jesus, not the Palm Sunday Jesus. I don't know when the next gathering of people in the streets is going to be, but we do hear the cries of people around us. The people who live in our very neighborhood, right around this building, out of cars, on streets, in bushes, who are so overcome by despair, they have absolutely no concept of how to move forward. Can we hear what they are telling us? Can we see the faces of the unknown people, unnamed people who approach us as we are at gas stations? Can we see the people who ask us on the street corners for a couple dollars and see beyond those simple surface meanings that honestly don't mean much, but see below to what their very existence evokes from within us? Do we have the faith to side with these people? Where is the world's narrative of fear, despair, and scarcity so ingrained in us that we try to block those people out, or perhaps even worse, stand against them? Which story are we telling ourselves? Hosanna or crucify him? Do we see our salvation in the glorification of a poor peasant riding not on a war horse but a donkey? One who displays to us the fissions and ruptures and inadequacies of our religious systems that we've held onto so tightly? Or is that so offensive to us that we just want him out of the way? We must sit with those questions. We must face them and answer them honestly. And in our Lenten posture, we must follow after the path of Jesus, treading in his footsteps, so that we may move with him through all of his movements towards the possibility of new life. Let's pray. God, may we hear your story. May we celebrate your triumphal entry into Jerusalem. May we not be counted among the number who distrusted that, who sought to undo your work, who were worried about what you were bringing. But may we remain faithful to it. We are uncertain, we are scared, we are doubtful, we admit that. We stand with your disciples who could not hold watch in the garden. We stand with your darkest moments as you cried, "May this cup pass from me." We sit in that place almost all the time. But give us that holy wonder and that deep faith to trust that what is on its way is right and beautiful and new that what is on its way is life. We thank you for the seed of faith you have planted in all of us. And we commit together before you to tend to that seed, that it may grow. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. On the night that Jesus was to be handed over to the authorities, that religious-y phrase that I say every week perhaps is a little more real on this Sunday as we approach celebrating that time. But on that night, he took bread and he blessed it, he broke it, he gave thanks for it, and he passed it out to his disciples. And he said, "This bread that we share in celebration and holy remembrance of our deliverance is my body. And just as I broke it, so I will be broken as well." He had talked about that for some time, if you read the gospel narratives. He had told his disciples that, but they didn't want to hear it. But maybe on this holy night, it felt a little more real as they had seen Jesus the last week, as they had heard the rumblings of the leaders plotting against them. In the same way, he took wine, and when he had blessed it and poured it out and given thanks, he said, "This wine poured out is my blood, which will be poured out." A somber time. Even still, that night, the disciples were concerned and afraid and fearful. But Jesus says to them, that pouring out, that brokenness is for your release. That your sin, that those things that bind you to the narrative of the world, the ways that you have internalized of fear and despair, he said, those are going to be taken away from you. You will be free to move forward in faith and hope and courage and life. And so, from now on, as often as you do it in remembrance of me, Jesus said. And so we share this small hint of a meal each week together to remind us of the meals we share together, of the connection we build together, the connections that keep us strong in the face of so much destruction and so much despair. We take physical bread and physical juice so that we remember our only hope is moving together in all parts of our lives as a community. Not just here on Sunday mornings, not just how we think or talk or what we believe, but in all of the physical, tangible ways. That is where our strength lies. This is where our strength lies. May grace flood your hearts this morning as we partake.